Good evening. This is John Bushka, and I just wanted to. I'll start by just showing a picture of the family house in Arlington, and after a major snowstorm, when I was growing up. That was the way it looked in the 60s and 50s, and then move on to what I want to talk about, which is comparative government as it applies to individual rights, particularly mine, and that's going to lead to some more specific discussion later of how individual rights work when they're challenged. Excuse me, but I want to talk just a little bit about the overall picture. And I'll just start by saying in January of 1961, there was a day in around the 20th, around the 18th or 19th, when I had 4 tests, and one of them in the last period was Virginian U.S. government, and there was a midterm exam, and there was one question on it, which was compare communism and democracy. We had to write an essay for an hour comparing communism and democracy. That was the only question. And really, if you look at the 1950 World Book Encyclopedia, which I have, there's a comparative government article that in 3 columns compares fascism, communism, and democracy. And we're talking about individual rights in terms of the way governance is applied to these individual rights, and they're as if there were 3 basic systems and democracy, or liberal democracy, is one of those systems. We talk about libertarianism as having as little government interference as possible. And we also talk about classical liberalism as being allowing reasonable governance, but trying to give the individual as much autonomy as, from the influence of the state anyway, or as is practical, and to have a system that's actually stable and works, mainly for adults. And in modern times, this has become very important recently, is when you apply it to freedom, particularly freedom of speech, and particularly on the net when anyone can see it, freedom of reach. Now let's just go back over the major systems. Fascism, which we of course know from Italy and then Nazi Germany, you could describe it as a hive of people bound by national blood, giving up their autonomy of thought to leadership. And it often eliminates the unfit, as well as various races or religions. Communism, which is common ownership of the means of production, and that includes real property, real estate, with people's work and their consumption of goods rationed by the state, with an emphasis on psychological comradeship rather than individualism, individual consciousness. So often totalitarian states mix the two of them up. And China, for example, has reached some stability with some sort of reasonable freedom, other than free speech and real property for people who comply. But of course, remember the zero COVID lockdowns, for example, how harsh they were. We won't get into how China and COVID started right now, but anyway. Democracy even is understood from the language of the United States Constitution, and correspondingly with constitutions or constitutional monarchies of other Western countries. Normally respects the autonomy of the individual and the need for fair representation in elected bodies, and with the need for rule of law being applied neutrally. It's supposed to. Obviously, early in the United States histories, this didn't apply to everybody. We had slavery, most of all slaves, but other groups too, indigenous peoples, for example. And then remember Brown versus Board of Education that we learned about in 7th grade in 1955 when I was in 7th grade. And it was applied with all deliberate speed, which meant that in 1961, in January of 61, the day before Kennedy's inauguration, that what can you do for what can I do for my country speech, when we had the big snowstorm and while I was taking that last government test. When we were largely still segregated. My high school was one of the top, Washington Lee, it's now Washington Liberty. It was one of the top in the country academically, but it was 99% white still. Um, and there hadn't been very much progress on since Board versus education. Of course, we know what the civil rights movement would be like in the 60s. And then 1969 with Stonewall and how gay rights would evolve and have to get through AIDS, and then less than 10 years later be dealing with gays in the military, and that would eventually solve, and then we'd eventually have gay marriage. But we know what's happened since then with gender ideology. I won't get into that today, but there's a long history. But what kind of democracy did the United States have in January, that day in January 1961 when the snow was accumulating? I would call it tribalized democracy. And perhaps, I think there's another term, it perhaps was hybridized has been used to the system we had also. The idea that you were responsible for your own conduct, of course, was paramount. If you caused a pregnancy, you had to be responsible for the child, and it applied especially if you were a boy and not careful. When you were dating, and as well as girls, and boys were told that. But individuals, even into adulthood, had understood obligations to their own lineages. And a lineage could be, in the sense I'm meaning, it would be your family, your extended family, or a tribe, or a religious affiliation, a denomination, excuse me, that you belong to, or a state, or even a nation, a country. And these were not just, it wasn't enough just to become self-supporting as an individual or as an adult, but you were originally supposed to hang out with your family and help raise your siblings or other relatives. And particularly if you didn't have your own children, filial responsibility, taking care of your elder, might fall more on you, which, since I didn't have any children, I was an only child, that's what happened in the 2000s, especially until 2010. And so there were many restrictions on personal behavior that were predicated on the idea that the most important thing was a family unit and a family lineage survive. And I think that's one of the primary reasons why homosexuality was largely taboo until it started to change in the 1960s. The other big thing was, of course, conscription, particularly of males in the Vietnam War. And we can argue about whether the Vietnam War was necessary. It may have been more necessary than you thought, and based on my own experience in the Army and what I know. But the controversy over student deferments in the 1960s illustrated the moral controversy that some people made sacrifices so other people could have their lives. And sometimes the most fit men physically, the most fit males physically, were the ones who made the sacrifices, and the less fit, it might have been me, prevailed. That was a big moral controversy. We don't think about it that way today, but that was the way we thought about it in the past. Now, over time, many personal freedoms have improved, but the needs of families that they used to go unmet, and the needs of the most disadvantaged, that is, left over from the past, particularly, you could say, because of systemic racism. That is true. The situation for many people has gradually gotten worse over the years. The economy has become even more unequal. It's become harder. The cost of living has risen. The cost of having an apartment has risen, or buying a house. And many more people have fallen down in the economic scale, even though some people do very well. And I mentioned the draft, by the way, because there are a lot of very young male YouTubers who have been, there's some that have been extremely successful and become almost wealthy doing that. When they were of draft age, we don't have an active draft now, but you can imagine what it would be like if we did. And the male-only draft is still, it's still the way it is in the male-only selective service sign up is still the way it is in the United States, and we've not been willing to face the moral debate over that in Congress, even though it was declared constitutional in 1981. Now, I would say that homosexuality in men may indeed be biologically related to male birth order, and that it may produce more males who could fight to defend the tribe or take care of others in a nurturing way, depending on a person's disposition. But in modern society, many leave home just as I did and lead separate adult lives. In my case, getting to adult autonomy through getting through the entire system of school and everything successfully came first. And I did have my unusual military service that I've documented elsewhere. And frankly, forming a family seemed like an afterthought, but it was kind of a hidden expectation. And if too many people behave the way I did, could be bad for society as a whole. Now, since the middle of the last decade, since about 2015 or 2016, when Trump became the candidate, the corporatization by tech, you could say their circular activism, the way tech went along with the demands of the woke, because of the possibility that activists could boycott their products and so forth. That was some of it. It's led to what we could call plutocratic democracy today, which is also a term that's used to show how unequal the things have gotten, even more unequal. And so that's been featured by the censorship of deplatforming some people from social media sites, or from their speech being heard at all, or the attempt to, and sometimes even debanking them in a few cases. I mean, it may be worse in the UK than it is in the United States. Speech that endangers supposedly marginalized groups and may make them targets of others is what is most censored. And of course, that's an incentive to try to create for the left, to try to make the impression that other groups are more marginalized than maybe they really are. This also calls attention to the idea of socialist democracy, or democratic socialism, and which in turn can get overrun by Marxism. Now, marginalized people are expected, according to the left anyway, marginalized peoples or individuals within marginalized groups are supposed to be loyal to their own identity groups as defined by intersectionality, and they're supposed to express solidarity and allyship, and they're supposed to get others to become allies of them, people that are maybe were marginalized in the past, like me, but have sort of assimilated and not as in need of that today as they were, to try to get people like me to go along and show solidarity with them. And they're supposed to and a lot of times give up their individual ability to think critically, which we've seen a lot recently with some issues. Now, the identity groups that marginalized communities on the left are supposed to form supersede the original identity of being part of a family or a lineage, or even of a religion, or even of a country. And my main concern, of course, is how this affects freedom of speech of the individual. The left wants to demand personalized reparations, you could say, or paybacks from privileged individuals. That might include me, who used to be part of a marginalized group, and they identify the people who would owe reparations or owe something back by the fact that they happen to belong to the group, merely being a white male. Being a white heterosexual male is the worst, but being an assimilated white gay male that perhaps is very picky about who he chooses would want as an intimate partner, is seen as an oppressor now. And maybe that's because that can kind of scale up and can become contagious. Um, the left could try to do a lot of other things. They could try to advance the idea of social credit more formally, which China has done, but they could try to do that. Or they could even try to reform inheritance law, which would get really interesting. I may talk about that later in another video. But it's easier just to simply demand things from people if they belong to the privileged group, and demand, even though some people who seem to belong to the groups aren't really privileged, and some people who do belong to marginalized groups have actually done very well. The affirmative action debate recently and the Supreme Court ruling recently. Now, personal freedoms can indeed be affected by developments like pandemic, and we've had two major epidemics that were very different in nature and affected very different groups of people. Or in the future by extensive climate change, or even demographics. In many countries and many societies, people not replacing their populations, not having as many children, and that will be not having enough children, and that will be something we'll talk about later. Again, the one reason for hyperpolarization is that hyper-individualism allows more people to fail completely as individuals and sink to the bottom, the race to the bottom. This has started getting worse after about 2012, and that can create pressures that can encourage dystopian or totalitarian development of a state, and could gradually cause a state to migrate towards communism or fascism. I'll just say that, there's a lot of talk of what happens in 2025 if a Republican wins. And I would be very concerned about it too. Particularly, I can't imagine Trump winning if he's still being prosecuted personally, but maybe I'm wrong. But there's a lot of concern about what would happen. It may be overblown. I think some of the concerns are about the management of elections and how votes are counted and so forth. That seems to be the biggest concern. But I will continue this talking about rights on a much more individualized level soon. Having a little problem with lighting in the unit because a major light went out, so just bear with me. But I, again, do thank you for listening.